team, I'm making a few adjustments to try to keep this part pretty short. So in fact, let's skip these two slides and go to Sharzi. But just by way of transition, I want to offer that what Megan has laid out is a stakeholder engagement process. And we wanted to leave you today with two tools that can be adapted and used in whatever way makes sense for you or not. Go ahead and skip to the next slide, Libby. I don't want people to get distracted by all my animation on the slides. The one tool is related to identifying your stakeholders, and Sharzi is going to really dig in with that one. And then the second tool is some questions. We just wanted to give you some starter dough to think about some of the types of questions you might ask those stakeholders.
On the X and Y axes, we want you to think about each stakeholder and how much do they affect your programming and how much are they affected by your programming. Does that make sense? We want you to place on the graph where you think your stakeholders are. Okay, if you can wrap up what you are writing down, and we can see, if you just look at the visual of this graph, I see folks have students, kitchen staff, teachers, peer mentors, high school leaders. And if we think about what Megan was sharing when she was presenting about Opal Creek and who are we including, because we're talking about co-creating evaluation questions, and then just thinking about co-creating our outdoor school programs and where folks are affected or where they affect us. This is our first step of where we think all of these stakeholders are. However, I want to reiterate what Deborah said in the beginning, which is that there are no evaluation questions that are inherently culturally responsive. So even in this mapping, the mapping of looking at our stakeholders is not inherently culturally responsive or equitable. It does not take into consideration those factors unless we are intentionally thinking about them. So if you were to go again back into this annotation, but this time instead of using the text tool, go to the check mark, that's the stamp tool, and pull out the heart. Think about, well, actually, I'll ask you a specific question instead of you making me think it. For those of you thinking about students, were you thinking about students who don't attend and what your outdoor school, like how your outdoor school affects them or how they are affected by the program? Are we thinking about students from marginalized communities such as students with disabilities and how they are affected by the programming you currently have and what that looks like? So taking that into consideration and thinking specifically about students and thinking about equity and cultural responsiveness, using the heart stamp, where would you locate students now? So I see that we have just 3 of the hearts, but if this is something that you are internalizing, it's difficult to think about what the realities are of students, especially because I'm asking you to make assumptions about students. You may have some of that information as you all have been going through this process with us and thinking more intentionally about what your stakeholder engagement looks like. But one thing that we want to stress is that stakeholder engagement in and of itself can be a harmful process in how traditionally we have gone into communities in terms of quickly trying to develop relationships and I'll put quotations around what those relationships actually are, and then trying to extract information from those communities to answer questions that we believe are important without their without any of those communities considerations, or without their input, without them being there to help co-create what the important questions are. And so a consideration, Libby, if you can go to the next slide and erase everything. So one of the considerations we think about is, we want you to think about is, who does your program or organization have ongoing relationships with? So as you are trying to map out your stakeholders, who are your stakeholders currently? What are those relationships like? Because we might have relationships that are deep and meaningful, and where we can actually go into spaces and provide feedback, where we can hear feedback from those communities that is positive as well as negative, and be able to sit with that and then grow from that. Or we might have very superficial surface level relationships. So understanding what those relationships are with our current stakeholders. And then as we are brainstorming who else we would like to have relationships with, who else we want to be a part of co-creating what our programming is, figuring out that we need to go about this from a relationship building perspective. The quote down here is from Deborah's earlier work in New Mexico, and it says, "Communities have been hurt by processes that move too quickly without building the relationships. This process needs to allow for the students in schools and communities, or whoever your stakeholder is, to build relationships with community members instead of just going in and quickly touching base with the community without being fully engaged." This really points and emphasizes the fact that stakeholder engagement without an intention to be authentic, so going back to our EE vals, without authentic engagement, without thinking about what strengths and wisdom are in the communities that we're engaging with, that we can learn from. And it's not just about us going into a space and giving them all of our wisdom, can harm any of our thoughts around program evaluation or program development. So we really have to think about, how are we advancing collaboration? How are we making sure that we understand what collaboration looks like, where all parties are benefiting and not just us benefiting from going into those spaces? Also thinking about, are we being deeply curious? Another one of our EE vals, truly being curious about others, considering the many ways in which folks learn, they evaluate. In the chat earlier, Dan made a mention around, do we have a similar understanding around definitions? So as we're going in, do we understand what those words mean? And how are we making sure that we're embedding that into the practices and to our culture of really including our stakeholders, or going out and reaching out into communities? Another consideration we have, if you can go to the next slide, Libby, is thinking about, who are you including? And in particular, this is about including younger people, but just who are we including when we are trying to engage stakeholders? From the get-go, traditionally, we try to engage those who have already bought into how we believe or how we process through what our worldview is. And so how do we bring in folks who can cause us to grow in our thinking, who can challenge us in a way that we are able to be challenged? What does that look like? And to help us with that, Deborah has a discussion guide that will really help when you are going and doing some of your stakeholder engagement practices.
Thanks, Sharzi. So Sharzi referenced work I've done in New Mexico. The guide I'm going to share with you grew from that and is adapted for outdoor school, meaning what I'm sharing with you is really starter dough. It's never been used for outdoor school before. And if you I really encourage you to think about reworking it to make sense in your own context. If anyone does use it or any questions from it, I'd love to know how it landed, how it went. But what I'm going to do is share a link in the chat that will allow you to make a copy so that everyone has their own copy of this discussion guide. And I do want to take a minute to walk through some of the notes at the top before you even get into the questions for discussion. It says this protocol provides a starting place for programs and organizations planning to engage local stakeholder groups. We recommend you, and then there's a number of recommendations. I'm not going to read through all of them, but but the theme that's present in them is that this is not a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter tool that we expect you to implement where you're at. We really want you to think about how this makes sense in your own community and who the groups and people are that you will that you might engage. As Sharzi said, we do encourage you to not simply engage, or to rather start with places where you have relationships rather than simply engaging to have this conversation.
Let's take a moment and debrief a little bit of what you heard, because we're moving from that to how you might go about revisiting the ideas of quality and success for yourself in your program. We are hoping that between now and session 5, you can use that discussion guide or any other conversation format that you see fit to facilitate a conversation and hear ideas about how we define quality and success in your program particularly. So using the link we shared in the chat or another model, we'd love you to have at least one conversation or ideally more than one, to hear a variety of ideas about quality and success in your program. So you can start close to home and then continue to push your edges of your, how you define what is the community? What are the voices that you want to have at the table? Does anyone have any other, from my group of facilitators, any other thoughts that I'm not sharing yet on this prompt?
I just want to say super quickly that, just in the spirit of sharing OSU's journey as well, that we are hoping to do something similar over the course of this next year.
This is how you can reach us, and we are very happy to have you with us today. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'll be here to stay on for a few minutes if anyone has any last-minute questions. But thank you so much